I'm very delighted to have the opportunity and actually the privilege to introduce to you Anthony Janetos. And I'm going to give his a little bit about him because he's one of these keepers, really a special, especially trained, but also a tremendous perspective on the global crisis that we're discussing this summer. His degrees are in biology. He graduated magna cum laude from Harvard College and then took a master's and a PhD in biology from Princeton University. But he moved from what you'd typically consider to be a biologist. We were talking a little bit today about natural historians and plant identification. He moved into mathematical modeling and the ability to make ecosystem assessments. And that's what he does without any peer that I know. He spent many, many years in managing science and policy research programs with the Environmental Protection Agency, with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and he's specialized, as I said, on ecological topics, environmental issues, as they relate, for example, to air pollution effects on forests, on climate change impacts, on land use changes, on ecosystem modeling, and the global carbon cycle. He was the lead author and convener of the Climate Change Science Program Synthesis and Assessment Product, and has been involved in any number, more than I can count, or he's led several national and international assessments on these topics. So his specialty is linking scientific, environmental, economic, and policy issues into a more of a whole cloth perspective for the consideration of very high-level policymakers. He's recently been director of the Joint Global Change Research Institute, which is a joint venture between Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and the University of Maryland. And so he lives a few blocks from the National Science Foundation in Arlington, and now is moving to Boston, which I'm happy for because he's a little closer to me. But Tony Janetos has now been named the new director of a center called the Frederick S. Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. And he will be presenting today some perspectives on communicating successes and failures on these assessments, but he'll also be clearly defining what he means by the longer future. And so I'd like you to welcome Tony to our podium. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Jim, thank you. I can see that you've already set the bar impossibly high. If I can do one out of the two things that Jim has indicated, at least I'll be happy. So let me talk a little bit. What I'd like to do is talk about what has become sort of a novel process in the communication of science. So this is not a strict science talk about what do we know about global changes in the environment, and how well do we know them, and what do the models say, what's the empirical evidence. What I want to talk about instead is how we communicate what we think we know in the scientific community to a wide variety of policy audiences. And so I thought I would start by talking about at least the kind of working definition that I'm going to use for what identifies a scientific assessment. And in this case, we're talking about processes that involve reviews of the underlying science by whole groups and communities of experts. It could be across disciplines, and in fact it is across disciplines in many cases, that are consensus-seeking processes, where the intent of the process is to try to come to some consensus on the state of knowledge about a set of questions that are particularly relevant to policy issues, that are commissioned or overseen by the policy audiences themselves, whether it's countries or states or other international, multinational institutions, and that are meant to address both our knowledge and major uncertainties that are perceived to be important for policymaking. And this really is, in a sense, a novel way of communicating with policy audiences. For scientists and academics and engineers of my generation, nobody nobody did this. People, you know, would regularly do annotated bibliographies. They would do literature reviews. You know, they would do these kinds of reviews for our scholarly peers. But the communication of what we knew about science to policy audiences was largely, in a sense, the province of particular individuals who had a desire or the opportunity to do that. It wasn't this sort of community process. And what's emerged since really since the mid-1980s is a whole new way, institutionally, of communicating about science to audiences who are going to make decisions in part on that knowledge. And so some of the questions that I think are important to keep in mind as we think about which of these efforts, in a sense, succeed and which fail, is who commissions the effort, who participates in the effort. You know, is there a coherent policy driver? Is there a coherent set of decisions or policies that are under consideration? Is there a receptive audience to the lessons and the knowledge and hopefully the wisdom that emerges from these processes? And how would we actually identify success? What's an appropriate metric for success? Because what we'll see is that there's lots of replication of processes that are perceived to be successes, and in some cases, I will argue, are successful, but not always with the same end results. And so it's then worth asking why not. So, for discussion this evening, I'm going to share some of my own experiences from working on several international and domestic U.S. scientific assessments. A lot of this work has had to do with climate change, but not all of it. I'm going to share my perceptions of the relative success of these communications effort and discuss with you at least my analysis of why some have been more successful than others. And then at the end, offer some suggestions, both topical suggestions for how these assessments might change over time, and a couple of process suggestions for how these assessments might change over time. So for international examples, I'm going to focus on three. One is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, about which I'll talk a great deal. The one in the middle, and I guess I'll need to apologize for the poor quality of that picture, is actually the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And the third is an assessment called the Global Biodiversity Assessment. And then I will follow that with several examples strictly from the U.S. At the top is the cover of the first U.S. National Climate Assessment of potential consequences of climate variability and change. On the left is a more focused scientific assessment on effects of climate change basically on natural resources, agriculture, water resources, land resources, biodiversity. And in the bottom right is the second U.S. National Climate Assessment on potential consequences of climate change. And I'm going to say something about each of these examples, about how they were commissioned, sort of how they came into being, what was their rationale, what was the reception to them, and in a sense, were they successful in their goals or not? And in so doing, I think one of the points that I really want to emphasize is that this type of scientific assessment, this type of community process, is a communications exercise. The criticism which you will hear and which you'll read that science is not advanced by processes like the IPCC, that they don't push the frontiers of knowledge is, in my view, completely irrelevant. These processes are not meant to do that. They are meant to seek consensus. They're not about blazing new trails. They're not about the sort of individual creativity and diligence and skill of the individual researchers or laboratories. They are, or at least they should be, entirely about communicating what we think we know as a community and the strength or weakness of our consensus, communicating that to fundamentally non-scientific policy audiences who care about that because scientific knowledge is a part of their decision-making process. And so in my view, these scientific assessments should be judged as communications exercises, which is not actually always appreciated by the participants. Because when you're in the mix of one of these things, you really do want to do the best job you can at summarizing and synthesizing the underlying science, and it's easy to lose track of who you're doing this for. So one interesting question is, if they're judged as communications exercises, should they be judged by the actual policy outcomes that either result or in some cases don't result from the effort? And I will argue that they should not. That the primary criterion for success is the acceptance of the process by policy audiences, and not necessarily whether or not a particular policy decision has been made or a particular policy direction has been established. The former, the acceptance of the process and the credibility of the process, is clearly under control of both the participants and the audience for scientific assessments. The latter, what decisions actually end up getting made or which directions end up getting put in place, is a function of many different factors, of which the scientific assessment is just one. It's a function also of economics, it's a function of equity, it's a function of in some cases, sort of the political economy of the decisions. It's a function of many things, of which scientific information is but one element. So I think it's important to keep in mind, I think, that what these assessments are really about is this sort of communication of knowledge, not achieving a particular scientific or a particular policy result. Now, in many ways, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, has been thought of in a sense as the gold standard of these kinds of processes, particularly in an international context. To be fair, IPCC was really built in a sense on the previous model of the stratospheric ozone assessment, which was the scientific input under the auspices of the World Meteorological Organization, was the scientific input to the process that led to the Montreal Protocol, and in fact did lead to significant policy change, that is the banning of chlorofluorocarbons from general use because of their effect on the ozone layer. IPCC, on the other hand, is a big, sprawling assessment that ranges from the causes of change in the climate system to the degree of detection of changes in the climate system, the attribution of human influence on the physical climate system, moving to the consequences of those changes, both physical consequences on natural resources, on agriculture, on ecosystems, on water resources, to increasingly to consequences on economic systems and social systems, on settlements, and in the last round of IPCC, beginning to extend to the consequences of changes in the physical climate system on the prospects for development and continued economic development and social development around the world. And the third part of IPCC is really dedicated to what can be done, and in particular what can be done to mitigate, that is to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, what are possible technological choices, what are different potential scenarios of future conditions, what are the implications of different energy choices, and so forth. And this entire effort is, in fact, clearly not prescribing policies the country should take, but is trying to analyze the suite of potential futures, their ramifications for both physical systems and social and economic systems, in a sense to illuminate the debate that countries have now undertaken in this very long convention process over multiple decades. The effort involved in this assessment, or in this assessment process, is enormous. It's an enormous effort, both on the part of the governments that sponsor it and that, in a sense, run it, and an enormous effort on the part of the scientific communities who participate. Literally, thousands of scientists, scores of governments, both periodic full assessments. We're now working on the on AR5, on the 5th full IPCC assessment for all 3 primary working groups, and a whole range of special reports, which were not part of the initial vision of IPCC, but grew up over time because it was literally not possible for this every 5-year scientific synthesis to address particular issues that countries thought they needed a particular handle on quickly. And so now we're in this mode that IPCC has effectively become a full-time assessment process with a full review, causes, consequences, mitigation, about every 5 or 6 years, but in what we might euphemistically think of as the off years, a series of special reports on particular topics driven by interest from the participating governments. So in fact, last year we had the publication of the special report on extremes. In previous years, we've had special reports on emission scenarios, special reports on aviation, special reports on land cover, land use change, and forestry, and a whole host of particular topics that have followed the same model, but have not delved into all of the ramifications. Is it successful? Is the IPCC successful? And I would argue that by my criterion, the answer is clearly yes. The reports themselves, whether it's the special reports or the big syntheses, are always an important part of international policy discussions. They're always an important part of national policy discussions, because, in fact, in large part because they're perceived to be credible statements of what's known and not known. They become less successful when that credibility, for whatever reason, is tarnished, whether that's errors, which not surprisingly creep into the system, or whether it's the perception that IPCC might, or the scientists involved in it, might be following their own agendas. So there are weaknesses in this system, for all that I would argue that it is, by and large, in fact, really a great success. It can't be relevant to all the possible approaches to policymaking. It's just not feasible to do. Particularly, it's not feasible for a huge international effort like IPCC to deal with the intricacies of national policymaking or regional policymaking in all of the countries and all of the parts of the world that it is meant to address. It's meant to be a global process. It's meant to be a truly international process. There is simply no way that the process of this scope can deal with every, sort of, in a sense, every possible policy scenario that an individual country might undertake. On the other hand, it still addresses a fairly clear policy issue, both in terms of mitigation choices, perhaps clearer in terms of mitigation choices than in adaptation choices, but there is a coherence to the debate that IPCC is seeking to inform. IPCC changes direction slowly. It is still sort of slowly approaching the topics of adaptation, of the interaction of the climate system with other global changes, with biodiversity changes, or with food security issues, or with development issues, for example. There's possibly an underappreciation of the importance of regional changes and issues of vulnerability and resilience. In fact, the chapter that I'm leading a chapter in Working Group 2 of IPCC, which is the working group on consequences and adaptation now, which is, the whole chapter is entitled Regional Context. This chapter has never existed before in previous Working Group 2 documents. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that the agenda can change and the perceived policy issues that IPCC responds to change, but they change slowly over time. It's still largely focused on sort of average results and mean results and has difficulty assessing extremes, in part because the process is highly dependent on modeling and it's much more difficult to model the variability in systems than it is changes in mean state. But it's also because it wrestles with how one talks about the probability or risk of extreme events in a highly polarized topic and not then be accused of cherry picking or fear mongering. And in fact, in some sense, quite unlike the stratospheric ozone assessment, in which the private sector and scientists in the private sector and engineers in the private sector were extremely important contributors, IPCC has not been a welcoming environment for the private sector. In large part because there is a perception that it's much more of an adversarial relationship with large firms in the private sector. Regardless of whether this is the desire of individuals, I think this is sort of the framing within which this has been done. We could contrast this, for example, with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And there are some interesting contrasts. So the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was really set up in large part to understand whether or not the services that we derive from ecosystems, the regulation of water supply, of water quality, the influence of ecosystems on air quality, the maintenance of soil fertility, in a sense, all of the functions that we depend on for human well-being, the extraction of fiber, of food, whether some of which are priced, many of which are not priced, but we depend on them anyway. So this assessment was really set up to understand whether these services are being sustainably managed over time, or whether we're, in a sense, eating away at the capital. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, quite unlike IPCC, was not specifically commissioned by the national governments. It really arose out of a combination of the scientific community, the international NGOs, who essentially went to the UN General Assembly and said, we want you to sponsor this. We want you to sanction this. We think this is important for everything from poverty reduction to development concerns. And it should be coincident with the goals and ambitions of the General Assembly. And in fact, the Kofi Annan agreed with that and specifically called for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in the UN General Assembly without a strong base in any one particular national government. The range of potential decisions was extremely broad compared to the climate issue. So now the climate issue is you know, I was talking with many of the graduate students just an hour or so ago about the incredible tangle and breadth of the climate issue, where really the policy issues are what are you going to do about the energy economy of the world, which is much more complicated than the Montreal Protocol. But think about this with respect to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and the sustainability of ecosystems and all of the sort of food and services that we derive from them. This ranges on policy issues, everything from food security to trade issues to conservation of wildlife and habitat to fisheries management to sustainable development and energy and climate. It's just an extraordinarily broad reach and a really quite incoherent collection of different policy actors and potential actions. It did introduce this unifying concept of ecosystem services and the trade-offs amongst services, but it was, I think, rather more difficult to make that connection to particular kinds of decisions in particular places. You might ask, what was the reaction of governments? And here, I think it would vary considerably by where you sat. If your perspective was simply from the U.S., there was a tremendous scientific reach of the Millennium Assessment into the U.S. scientific community. But into the U.S. policy community, I would have to say that the reach has been really rather minimal. Outside of some decision-making bodies and agencies in the conservation field. But in the Scandinavian countries, on the other hand, who were very strong proponents and contributors and participants in the MA, there was a much stronger reach. And a lot of this, I think, had to do with individuals who sat on the board, individuals who took it upon themselves, in a sense, to be champions in their country for the conclusions of the Millennium Assessment and of the process. But it was very much a mixed reaction as to whether or not the conclusions from the Millennium Assessment were, in a sense, taken up in policy discussions. The third international example that I want to just touch on is the Global Biodiversity Assessment. That was that nice sort of blue cover on the bottom right. This is probably the best summary of biodiversity science you never heard of. And therein lies the tale, I think. It had many of the same operational features of IPCC and indeed of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment: international participation, broad oversight, consensus-seeking activity, a very serious attempt to summarize and communicate clearly through executive summaries and summaries for policymakers. It was almost entirely a creation of the scientific community. It was not commissioned by the governments, either national governments. It wasn't actually commissioned or requested by the Biodiversity Convention itself. It was a self-organized effort, and the reception in those policy-making communities was essentially nil. There's essentially no take-up of the messages and conclusions and the process from the Global Biodiversity Assessment, even though the Secretariat of the convention and UNEP as institutions were strong supporters of the process. So there was sort of an institutional, in a sense, sort of bureaucratic institutional buy-in by very knowledgeable and influential people, but the countries themselves or the institutions themselves that had to make a set of decisions essentially shrugged this aside. Now, partly, I think this is partly a not invented here type of syndrome, but also partly a lack of focus on the particular questions that were immediately relevant to policymaking. You would be hard pressed to go through the GBA and identify the set of issues around which countries or large institutions actually had to make decisions. Whereas it's actually fairly clear in IPCC and the climate issue what types of decisions are at least on the table to be made. Whether they get made or not is a different talk, but everybody understands, I think, what the menu is. Not so much for the Global Biodiversity Assessment. So, in summary, if I look at these international examples, I at least conclude several things. And one is the importance, in fact, critical importance of national audiences in addition to the international bodies. Even though these are global issues and international issues, that international governance by itself is not sufficiently strong to act as sort of a take-up for the scientific assessment processes. National governments have to be part of this process. Secondly, is that the clarity of the policy questions and issues, and in a sense the coherence of those issues, matters tremendously. You really do have to understand what the menu of choices is if you're going to try to inform that discussion successfully. Third, and this is a point of similarity, is that there was tremendous support in each of these efforts for summaries, policymaker summaries, executive summaries, and other similar communications tools. To this day, you can go to the Millennium Assessment website and download at least 3 or 4 versions of the summary slides of the conclusions of the assessment. In a sense, there is a long-lasting information base and conclusion base on which to build. And lastly, I think there needs to be recognition of the policy communities that the assessments have value for them. There's some sense of co-ownership of the process. So I'm gonna switch directions a little bit now and focus on some domestic examples and some U.S. examples. And because these are largely through my own sort of personal lens and experience, this is going to focus a lot on climate change. I'll talk about the first and second national climate assessments. I'm going to talk a little bit about this interim assessment of potential impacts on natural resources. And I'll just point out that we're in the middle now of the third national climate assessment. And that's worth keeping in mind. So let me talk about the first national climate assessment. This was the cover that was on the top of that little triangle of covers. The need for a national climate assessment is actually written into the authorizing legislation for the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which is the collection of agencies who are charged with supporting and stimulating research on global change. It was a broad national effort. It focused on potential impacts of climate change and climate variability. There was really no significant reference to mitigation. So it's quite unlike IPCC in that respect, where there's a whole working group devoted to mitigation issues. This one, the first U.S. assessment was really devoted to impacts. A lot of effort devoted to stakeholder interaction and engagement. Again, quite unlike IPCC, which is a creature both of the sponsoring governments and of the scientific community, without really much outreach into other stakeholder communities. The U.S. national assessments, on the other hand, from this very beginning, in large measure, have really emphasized the need to understand the desires and perspectives of a wide range of stakeholder communities. I think in large part, because they have been focused on potential impacts in a large number of different sectors. There were both regional and sectoral studies that were done commissioned specifically for the assessment, and then a short national summary. But in addition to the national summary, there were well in excess of 20 or 30 additional publications on a set of 20 regional workshops that have been held on particular technical issues, on sectoral issues, and including a very detailed national report that has all of the details of the analyses and the data. That is, I suspect only a handful of graduate students have ever cracked open, but it was really quite an extraordinary research resource, as opposed to an assessment for the policy communities. Were we successful? And I use we in this case because I was actually one of the co-chairs of this effort. The synthesis report was leaked in draft form. It got enormous attention in the press. There were literally thousands of comments in peer review, which is not unusual. But for a roughly 125 page document, I think we had probably about 10,000 comments, each one of which has to be responded to and archived and sort of put into a permanent docket, sort of carefully documented responses. There were oversight committees that made sure we had done an adequate job of responding. But the report itself, the national report itself, was released the week after the Al Gore, George Bush presidential election. And you might remember that we were all a little bit distracted from climate policy and environmental policy at that time. This was not the first thing on anybody's mind. And in fact, the new administration actively suppressed the report to the extent that at one point the agencies were actually, for the U.S. science agencies, were forbidden from citing it, literally forbidden from citing it in their research planning efforts and in subsequent reports. Its results, on the other hand, were in fact highly influential in reports in the national academies and informally in the agencies in informing and influencing their research agendas of the major scientific agencies. On the other hand, on state and local levels, many of the studies and reports that went into the national report were extremely influential, including particularly here in New York, where researchers here at Columbia, across the street at Barnard, were key players in what was then called the Metro East Coast Study, which became the major part of the scientific underpinning for the city's climate adaptation plans. A similar thing went on in the New England states and the Northeast states, where the regional reports on the Northeast were highly influential in a sense, sort of setting the scientific atmosphere under which the RGGI program was developed. Same thing was true in California. So the influence of this report in informing policy decisions was very much a mixed bag. I would have to say that on the national level, it really was, in a sense, only influential on research agendas. It had very little influence, if any, tangible influence on the policy discussion right around that time. On the other hand, on state, local, and regional levels, that process had very much more influence. Over some time, the receptivity to climate change scientific assessments actually improved. During the Bush administration, the Global Change Program commissioned a whole series of individual scientific assessment reports, in part to fulfill the requirements of their underlying legislation, in part because there was a growing appreciation, even in this very polarized political environment, that there really did need to be this underlying input of scientific thinking. In the case that I put up there, again, this was an effort that I was one of the co-leads for. This was one of about 20 different reports. This one, the one I showed you, focused particularly on the influence of climate change on natural resources. And we know that this was influential with individual agencies, with USDA, with the Department of Interior agencies, with EPA. In USDA, we actually ended up having some very serious discussions with the officials in charge of the crop insurance programs about, were the crop insurance programs structured adequately to reflect what we thought was going to be a set of increased risks of failure? And were they prepared for that? So it actually stimulated a whole set of thinking that they hadn't really appreciated before, but it didn't have the sort of broad national attention that the first national climate assessment did, or that subsequent national climate assessments have either had or are meant to have. The second report largely summarized the work of this whole series of individual topical reports that had been commissioned. And although it started in the tail end of the Bush administration, it was endorsed and officially released by the White House in the first Obama administration. And in my sense, I view that as actually a major plus, that it was a signal that this scientific assessment process was viewed to be nonpartisan, to the extent that even though it had begun in a previous political administration, it was still embraced and released and endorsed by a very different administration. It was touted by the officials who released it as a game changer. But I think we'd all be forgiven if we were to ask if that has really been true. And we're now in the middle of a third national climate assessment, which repeats many of the features of the first one. A very large investment in stakeholder consultation and stakeholder engagement, a whole series of both sectoral and regional reports, of topical reports that are being incorporated into a synthesis document. And interestingly, for the first time in the U.S. national assessments, we're finally addressing the issue of mitigation directly, as opposed to the previous assessments, which dealt with it not at all. We finally have one chapter out of 30 devoted to mitigation. So the balance of, in a sense, the balance of this particular science that has been chosen to be addressed has started to swing a little bit, in a sense, from the opposite perspective of the IPCC, which was focused very early on the physical sciences, a large effort on mitigation decisions, and has sort of slowly been trying to really work on adaptation issues. The U.S. assessment is sort of in a very different trajectory. So these national efforts have some interesting similarities to IPCC. This notion of consensus seeking, specific attempts to summarize things for policy audiences, but also some quite significant differences. This focus almost entirely on impacts and climate science, that it's important for impacts, very little attention to mitigation until just recently, much more effort to engage broad communities of stakeholders in local, state, and regional discussions and to try to understand what are the issues that are important to them so that we can actually structure the scientific assessment, in a sense, around those issues. But their national influence is, I think, tempered greatly by the polarization of the political discussion of climate change. And it's an open question, I think, how many of these factors will change for the third national climate assessment. I actually, on the train ride up this morning, I had been emailing with a colleague who also worked on the first and the second national climate assessments, and I told her, I said, well, I'm going to go give this talk at Columbia. Sort of here's the general thesis about it. And so she emailed back and said, well, are we going to be a success or a failure this time? I said, beats me. I guess we'll find out. So the last thing I want to do is take some of these observations about assessment processes and think about some lessons for the future, because I think this kind of communications approach is with us to stay, and it's important, I think, to now start to think through how we might want to construct these processes in a way that the assessments have a well understood role to play, and that we recognize what they've done well and what they haven't done well. And in some extent, they've done really well in characterizing what's known. To some extent, they're a little more challenged with characterizing what's uncertain. And so, just as an example, one of the key findings from the last National Climate Assessment is this notion that thresholds are going to be crossed, leading to large changes in climate and ecosystems, and we can actually be quite confident about that because we're starting to see empirical evidence of this in today's world. This is just one example of these sort of vast infestations of bark beetles. This happens to be spruce bark beetle in Alaska, that are far outside any historical precedent. Or that climate change is an interactive process. It will interact with many other social and environmental stresses, changes in energy demand, the interactions of water shortages and the need for cooling water for thermoelectric electricity production. But we also have to recognize that these processes are about more than simply the science. We don't always do as well putting these major scientific issues into a broader context, or in expanding the scientific agenda or the assessment agenda away from the sort of is it happening to how well do we understand potential responses and the consequences of potential responses. Or, for all the attention that we focus on it, I think we've yet to really grapple with this notion about the importance and influence of uncertainty. And I say this with some trepidation, because every one of these processes, whether it's domestic or international, always starts with this very vigorous debate about the importance and crucial nature of communicating uncertainty to the policy audiences. And in some sense, I think we've kind of erected this monument to the importance of uncertainty in decision making. But the fact is that we deal with uncertainty and we decide anyway. We do this all the time. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a digression and talk about uncertainty using an example that some of you are the beneficiaries of and some of you are wrestling with right now. And that is, how do you save for college? Right? Because one thing, you have to understand the nature and the size of the problem. Are you thinking about in-state tuition, out-of-state tuition, private tuition, 4 years or more? How many kids are you trying to put through? What's your goal? Full support? Half the cost of tuition? You know, are you just starting now? So for those of you on this side of the room, that's probably a salient question. You know, and then what are the implications? You know, can you afford to send that second kid? And what about other things in your life that you also value? Going on vacation, buying a car, a whole range of things. You know, we solve these kinds of problems all the time without being able to predict the precise future of our investments because we know how to think about them. We know how to hedge our bets, or at least we learn how to hedge our bets. We don't let the presence, the inevitable presence of uncertainty about the future, whether it's the longer range future or the shorter range future, paralyze us in terms of important life decisions. And there's no particular reason why uncertainty in these difficult environmental issues should paralyze us from appropriate decision making. So my last set of recommendations, I think, are focused primarily on climate, but I think these can be more general as well. And in some sense, we want to look for the integration of different disciplinary perspective, more appreciation for the actual range of decisions that will be considered, and how to approach these questions of interactions with other policy issues. So, for example, the scientific assessment processes, both in the US and internationally, have mostly not asked the question, is climate the biggest factor to deal with? And this has led, I think, to some significant misunderstandings in both directions. Thinking that climate is a really big factor when it's not, and thinking that climate is unimportant when it's not. The timescales of phenomena that we're concerned about matter a great deal in this. If you think about water resources and drought, the sort of what do you do about managing the dam next week to assure that you have continuity of flow for thermoelectric generation, in a sense, is not a climate problem. It's a weather problem. And you know, we have a lot of experience for how to deal with that. Dealing with the effects of persistent, interannual, historic levels of drought in the U.S. Southwest is absolutely a climate problem. Our institutions are not set up to deal with that very well. They're inflexible, and we're failing at that. And that is part of the challenge, part of why climate is a challenge, and the sort of this differentiation between weather challenges and long-term climate challenges. The second thing is that adaptation matters. These typical assessments have investigated impacts sans adaptation. In a sense, they're a sensitivity analysis. How sensitive are agricultural systems or crop production to changes in the climate world? But in the real world, adaptation matters a lot. We have examples from health risks, where in fact in individual cities, heat wave mortality declines over time, even with the same degree of meteorological event, because people learn. There's institutional learning, there's individual learning, there's institutional learning, there's preparation for the next event. We've seen the same thing in coastal risks, where we've got this vast exposure of infrastructure, but in some cases the hardening of defenses. And we see the same thing typically in agricultural systems with changes in management strategies, crop breeding, and so on. We should, in fact, have a new generation of assessments that begins to incorporate these human adaptation responses as more than simply an assessment of the physical science by itself. So we should be moving away from sensitivity analyses and improving our abilities to characterize risks on this interannual to decadal timescales. If we have some availability of adaptation options, how much influence or additional damage does climate change actually have? What's the sort of marginal increase or decrease in risk from climate change? Where are there trade-offs between mitigation decisions and adaptation decisions? What trade-offs, for example, are inherent in decisions to promote the use of purpose-grown bioenergy crops for storing carbon on landscapes, which is by far the cheapest way to store carbon. The physical science is going to remain important, but it's difficult in the short to medium term because of the influence of natural variability. Downscaling, this notion that we have this desire to say something concrete about changes in the climate system for New York or New York State, as opposed to North America or the Northern Hemisphere, is going to remain a difficult physical and statistical challenge. So we might, for example, argue that instead of the sort of predict then act model, we move towards a model that we consider a range of actions and evaluate which of those potential choices is robust to our scientific uncertainty in how the climate system will evolve. But the climate future we get also depends on how much forcing there actually is. And so this challenge of energy choices and mitigation choices and how development works is enormously important. We can't know this, right? But so we have to model it. And here I think increasing sophistication in how we think about scenarios and the use of scenarios to span uncertainty and structure the way we think about the future will in fact become more important rather than less, in my view. So these processes will be the most useful, I think, when they really come to grips with a singular reality about scientific assessment. That these are communication activities in a risk management and decision-making context, and that they focus on the important thing. Not just that the sign has sharp edges, but that the bridge is out ahead. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us here. I have a specific question with regards to the first national assessment. I was wondering what were the reasons for why there was such a push towards limiting its divulgence.
I'm sorry, for limiting its...
For why the administration at the time was so vehement in not getting it out. Was it for political reasons? Or?
Well, I mean, I won't make a political judgment. There was this dramatic change in administrations, you know, and in their approach towards environmental issues. It was also, and so I think the dimensions of those arguments had already become really quite polarized in ways that other environmental issues had largely not been, right? This was really sort of a political battlefield, and I think for those of us in the scientific community who participated in that assessment, we found ourselves talk about deer in the headlights. I mean, I think we found ourselves just sort of, in some sense, sort of baffled. You know, why were these people saying such horrible things about us, and why was I getting emails that I couldn't show my mother, and partly I think that's the stakes are really high. The stakes are high. Partly because there was also this ongoing sort of virulent policy debate about what to do about the Kyoto Protocol. This was also exactly the same time as the U.S. was in the middle of negotiating in Kyoto. And, so there was this sort of one theory that the whole assessment process was, in a sense, sort of cooked up to provide the fear factor to get the U.S. to agree to Kyoto. If that was the case, nobody ever told us. But there were people who really strongly believed that. And I think when you're faced with that kind of polarization, it's really hard to convince people that you're not part of that discussion. That you really are just trying to shed some light on sort of the underlying principles.
Thank you.
I was just curious if there has been moving from, I'm thinking now in political science and the study of commissions as an idea. Generally, commissions are received historically in this society and other societies, sort of like here we have an alert to a problem and then it's sort of diffused, or it can be looked on as sort of a stopgap measure politically. And when you look at all these different studies, some of which I've read, I wonder how and what your thoughts are of how they've actually been dimensionalized in public opinion, concretely, in the different phases they've actually been put out. Is it just elite public opinion? Because usually when you deal with foreign policy issues, at least the way I was taught 30, 40 years ago, only 10% of the population pay attention.
Right.
Perhaps only less than
Right.
1 or 2 or 3% pay attention to this. So I'm just wondering how that's evolved in practical terms in mass opinion with these kind of policy, these studies. And in our country, is there regional variations of this?
There are clearly regional variations. We saw a lot of this actually in the run-up to the first National Climate Assessment, where we did, I think, 22 workshops all around the country. It was absolutely fascinating. And we didn't start the workshops by saying, you know, we want to talk about climate change. We started all the workshops by saying we want to talk about the issues that are important to you in, or at least the environmental issues that are important to you in your part of the world, your part of the country, and then use that as a springboard to identify whether or not climate change was important in that context or potentially important in that context. Had we started the discussion with climate change, I think we knew perfectly well what would have happened. We would have had half the audience would have just switched off, and the other half would have been on top of us for, you know, why aren't you just talking about choose your favorite response, cap and trade, carbon taxes, that we were already at this sort of polarization point. I don't know whether or not the public reaction to these various assessment reports is sort of equivalent to, sort of high-level commission. Personally, I hadn't thought about it quite that way before. I do know that, particularly when IPCC reports come out, there is often sort of a bump in sort of attention being paid to global change issues, climate change issues. What is also true is you get a bump when you get weather disasters. There was a huge bump after Sandy. There's a huge bump after major heat waves. There's a lot of, the big fires that are in Colorado right now. I'd bet you that there's a bump in Colorado after those fires go through. And so whether or not that's persistent is not so clear. But one thing that is persistent is the, in a sense, the importance of the issue. The public attention to it will wax and wane, but this is truly a long-term issue that we are going to be grappling with for decades, I think.
Hello. So you talked a little bit about adaptation and the possible ways that cities around the world are doing this already. But how would cities like New York or along the East Coast adapt to extreme weather events like Sandy, or a change or loss of biodiversity in areas such as the Amazon, and where peoples are extremely dependent on their ecosystem?
Mm-hmm. So actually New York has one of the best articulated and most complete adaptation plans of any major city in the U.S. They spent a lot of time on it, looking primarily at sort of the major pieces of infrastructure. There's sort of known sensitivities. The subways already flood in a big persistent thunderstorm. So it's not, and the city has started to try to figure out, okay, so what are we going to do about this as the climate system continues to change? Boston is doing the same thing. Boston actually started doing that when they rebuilt the Deer Island sewage treatment plant. They built it about, 3 feet higher than they had originally planned. The marginal cost of doing that is nil. It's just small compared to the overall cost of the project. But it was clearly a protective feature. In some sense, one of the adaptation challenges for cities especially here, I mean, in the U.S., is that, and especially in the East, is we have these old industrial cities where this infrastructure is sort of going to be in this turnover phase anyway. And so when you've got the opportunity, what do you do? What's the right thing to do? And I think that does provide some opportunities for the cities to do some creative things looking forward.
I'm curious about the global biodiversity assessment. I have 2 questions about it. One, what prompted these scientific communities to put together this independent assessment in the first place? And second, maybe can't be answered until the next such effort comes out, but what do you suppose they might have taken or learned from the fact that they just did not make the splash that they were hoping for?
Well, I think the answer to the first one is that we're in the middle of the biggest extinction event, sort of the 6th major extinction event. There's no great, it's not a meteor this time. It's not lava traps. It's us. We're doing it. All right. Background extinction rates, or current extinction rates for flora and fauna that we know about are sort of on order 1,000 times higher than recent background. It's no great mystery. Why? And so there's been a long-standing concern in the scientific communities, even outside of the conservation communities, that this is not a sustainable pattern, and that there should be, that people need to understand. There's sort of a need for understanding this, and also a need for really understanding what some possible responses to it are. So in a sense, that was sort of the simplest possible motivation, that there was not a broad appreciation of the magnitude of the changes involved, and not a broad appreciation of the sorts of things that might be done, and sort of what was the scientific basis, and so on. I think that a lot of lessons were learned by the participants and the leadership of that assessment, and in particular about the importance of engaging sort of these more coherent policy audiences as the assessments are undertaken. I think the big challenge in the global biodiversity assessment was that, in a very real sense, nobody asked for it except us. And so when we finished, we had the staff and the secretariat of the major convention who were really excited about it, but not necessarily the participating countries. And so I think there's a lesson there. There's a lesson there about global governance, environmental governance. There's a lesson there about both the opportunities and the limits of engaging the actual decision-making communities or institutions beforehand. And we'll see if we've learned our lesson.
I actually have another question about both of those assessments, the GBA and the MEA. And wondering, sort of, is part of the kind of salience on a global level from something like the IPCC, the fact that a lot of this evidence is coming from things like GCMs, but the very nature of ecology is such that, as practiced as a science, with the scaling issues over time and space, where you can't really come up with that kind of global evidence, and a true kind of compilation of, current knowledge is going, by definition, to be a sort of real hodgepodge.
I think there's some of that. I don't think that's a sufficient explanation, though. Because certainly the trends for reductions or trade-offs in either in ecosystem services or in the loss of diversity are in fact global trends. I mean, they're globally important phenomena. There's a handful of major causes. I do think that the scientific communities, the structure of the scientific communities who are sort of primarily engaged, on the other hand, is very, very different. Right? And so those of us who are trained as ecologists weren't necessarily originally trained to think of these as sort of global, what sorts of global trends are out there, and how would you analyze them, and what do you think about them? It's just sort of not outside of the of the training envelope, or at least it was. Less so now, I think. I think there's more appreciation both in the scientific community about how important some of these larger scale patterns actually are.
I've got a question about how you characterize the policy community. So, I mean, is there ever talk about trying to really reach beyond, like, let's say, the typical policy community to groups like, I don't know, if I think other organizations, like from unions, community organizations, religious organizations, and I mean, I guess, are people talking about doing that, and if so, what kinds of challenges would that entail?
People do it. Right? I mean, this is one of the big differences between the U.S. national assessments and the international IPCC process. The IPCC process is a governmentally driven process, right? So national governments count. Almost nobody else counts. The other kinds of organizations have their influence in the framework convention, in the political discussions, but not in the scientific assessment. On the other hand, for the U.S. national climate assessments, there's been a very large effort to engage a whole variety of other sorts of communities and other sorts of audiences. Local governments, state governments, regional compacts, NGOs, faith-based groups, scientific societies. Some of that is for sort of dissemination of the message. Some of that is to actually understand what their concerns are and sort of, in a sense, what their menu of actions are that might require some illumination that, you know, where the scientific community could actually be helpful.
Great.
So it's a very different atmosphere than IPCC.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. As the scientific community starts to shift the conversation more towards adaptation, what segments of the academic community and what industries within the private sector seem to be most responsive to that shift and most willing to engage in that conversation?
I think that shift has really highlighted a weakness in many of the underlying research programs. The importance of the social sciences and economics to dealing with adaptation topics is, you know, in a sense, it's hard to overestimate, and we really don't, I think, have enough people involved in understanding those issues, whether it's sort of institutional change or sort of even just the economics of adaptation. You know, it's been quite interesting to see, you know, sort of which of the private sector communities, you know, have kind of jumped first, right? Because there's still, not surprisingly, I think, a lot of the private sector interest on climate change issues has revolved around the energy sector, understandably. But one of the really fascinating features about the energy sector, of course, is that it, you know, there's a lot of fixed infrastructure. And so, you know, Katrina got a lot of attention, not just because of New Orleans, but because it interrupted supplies of natural gas into the U.S. for a significant period of time. And the fate of all those derricks in the Gulf, you know, there's maintenance involved, there's operations involved. How did the big energy companies start to think about that? Well, this is looking at the energy sector not as a driver of climate change, but as a recipient and impacts of climate change. And we've actually focused a fair amount on that in this third national climate assessment, you know, where sort of impacts on energy is turning out to be a really important and quite interesting feature of the report.
You began your discussion with the issue of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And when I've listened to scholars who are from different disciplines talking about climate change, uncertainty is something they accept. That's sort of part of the scholarly discourse. But unfortunately, when you communicate that to the public and to elected officials, they jump on it. That's like the barn door open, let's drive through. So how do you bridge that gap? Because it's perfectly reasonable to talk about uncertainty, but then on the other hand, if you're dealing with people who have limited resources and are doing analyses of policy choices, A, B, C, D, where to put money, well, they can sit there and hammer the uncertainty issue, and I'm just curious, because as a communication question in general, it doesn't resonate with people if they can then take uncertainty and then discredit the analysis that's very deep and
Yeah, this
sophisticated.
just makes it sound like we don't know anything.
Exactly.
And so why should we make big decisions if you don't know anything? And I wouldn't make big decisions if I didn't know anything either. So I wish there were a really easy answer to that question. What a lot of us who've been involved in these processes try to do is to be honest about where the uncertainty is and what kind of uncertainty it is. So, for example, I do a lot of sort of public talks on climate change issues, and I talk about change in the atmosphere, changing the atmospheric composition. Where does this extra CO2 come from? You know, because there's essentially no uncertainty about that. We've known since about 1955 where the extra CO2 comes from. You know, it's extremely well documented. The fact of the greenhouse effect is you know, sort of, this is beyond serious question. So there are elements of the climate change issue for which there is really very little uncertainty. There are other elements in which there is I'll use a very qualitative term, a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and the challenge, I think, is teasing out the parts that matter and the parts that don't. You know, does it matter for policy making or decision making that no one is going to be able to give you a weather forecast for 2035 for eastern Long Island? They're just not. You will get people who will tell you they can do that, but they can't, and they won't. There's just sort of mathematical limits to predictability, and on the other hand, do you really need that to make those decisions? If you had that information, would you actually be able to use it? And in many cases, the answer to that is no. And so I think part of the challenge is being sensible about which parts of this uncertainty, the spectrum of uncertainties, actually is relevant to the decision-making at hand. Because otherwise, I mean, you're right, it can be used as a crutch. Well, these guys aren't sure, so we aren't going to decide.
Tony, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
And you clearly showed us how climate timescales and especially ecosystem timescales are really quite different than weather event timescales, political timescales, and this issue attention cycle, which can be extremely short. So that's one issue, is the incommensurability somehow, and how to bring that into conversation. The other one is we're going to hear in the future, some of our evening speakers will be talking about the polarization of climate discourse. And some might even talk about a bipartisan way forward, but we have 190 nations or more, and we have really an international issue here. We'll also hear about methodological best science, multidisciplinarity, but we also know that we need all of our disciplines to address these issues. And ultimately, it even becomes beyond disciplines into a human behavior and existence problem. So all this is kind of a long-winded way of setting you up to discuss your vision of the Pardee Center. Not only the longer future, but the timescales of the longer future, and the way forward, which was some of your ending slides about the way forward. How do you know, and what is the vision of going from these assessments, which are often domestic, well, they're often best science multidisciplinarity. And so, you know, it's a softball question, but I'd like to hear the vision of what is the big way forward?
Well, let me narrow that a little bit, and at least talk about the Pardee Center. So the Pardee Center has this you know, sort of interesting title of the study of the longer range future. But I think, you know, sort of underneath that is the concern with changes that we see in societies, both in the physical environment, in the cultural environment, in the social and economic environments, that occur over these sort of time scales of several decades, you know, sort of out to a century. And part of the reason that that time scale is so interesting and so difficult is that a lot of the institutions that we have aren't really well constructed to deal with problems over those scales. And so if you think about issues that are totally outside of the realm of science, physical science, you know, completely outside of that, like the future of the Social Security Trust Fund, right? It is a sort of an inevitable function of demographics that we're going to be supporting a growing number of retirees with a smaller number of workers. That's a problem. That's, you know, in a sense, it's arithmetic. And look how long we've been discussing that problem in our institutions without really making much of a dent on it. And so I'll just use that as sort of emblematic of the kinds of changes in the world that we can see happening. We can see them starting to unfold, but understanding their consequences and understanding the range of potential solutions turns out to be quite difficult. The other kinds of issues that at least I see as being particularly important for a center like the Pardee Center are the challenges that in the interrelationships between the developing world and the industrialized world. You know, we are headed for a world with 9 billion people, maybe 10. We don't know how to feed that world. Most of those people are not going to live here. They're going to be in very large cities and urban areas, mostly in the developing world. How do we think about a world like that? You know, this is a very different world than we have today. But in a sense, it's the further elaboration of trends that we can already start to see unfolding. And yet, you know, we have choices ahead of us. And so I think one of the really important things that a place like Pardee can do is to start to understand both with single disciplines and in a multidisciplinary way, what do those choices look like? How well do we understand them? What are the forces at work? Do we understand what interventions might be sensible? What their consequences are? We run a graduate seminar, much as you're doing during the summer, and one of the things that we told the students just a couple of weeks ago was that part of the challenge of thinking about these kinds of issues in this interdisciplinary way is that what you're really doing is you're recognizing the problems the way the world presents them. The world doesn't present us with problems that are, okay, here's one for the biologists, here's one for the sociologists, you know, here's one for the economists, and you guys all go off and play and come back when you're done and tell us what the answers were. It's not the way we get them. You know, they're messy, they kind of bleed into each other, they require multiple perspectives simply to understand, much less to try to help people think about potential paths forward.
Cool. Well, I, for one, hope to take the Downeaster to visit you at BE. Let's thank our guest, Tony. Thank you very much.